Okay, everyone, welcome back to CSE 373. In this lecture, we are going to be talking about hash maps and hashing and how we could go ahead and implement a structure that is just so darn fast. It's used basically everywhere. So before we dive into kind of what today is going to look like, what we're going to be talking about, we have a few announcements. So remember that exercise 1 is due tonight, Friday, at 11:59 p.m. Just like any of our other assignments, you are able to use late days, just like the projects. We're also going to be releasing your next project, Project 2, which I'll talk about in just 1 second, and the next exercise, Exercise 2, released today. Exercise 2 is going to be due next week, 1 week from today, and Project 2 will be due a week after that. Again, I'll talk about Project 2 just a little bit more in 1 second. As a reminder, we have that summations reference that we published on the course calendar for Wednesday's lecture. So those summation identities are really weird when you first see them. We don't expect you to understand why they compute the values they do. But we will just ask you to use them, and we have that reference there so you can use any of the identities we provide. We'll also have it on the section handout from Thursday, a cheat sheet version of this, so it's a little bit easier to reference if you're using that to work on something. So to talk a little bit about Project 2, Project 2 is all about maps. So we're going to implement everyone's good pal, the hash map. So we define the map ADT, which I'll kind of review in just a second. It's going to look a lot like Project 1, look at multiple data structures under a single ADT. But this time we're going to have some algorithmic analysis tools to reason about more complicated situations. So especially thinking about that case analysis when thinking about your experiments. So this project also has 3 parts. You have to implement an array map and this other structure called a chained hash map. We'll introduce those today. And then you have an experiment section. I highly recommend that you and your partner start this project early. In particular, there's one part of this chained hash map when you have to implement this thing called an iterator, and that can take a little bit of time. So we're giving you more time on this project. It has longer than 1 week for you to work on it because it's a bit more challenging. So we want you to encourage you to start this early rather than starting this one last minute. So now with those announcements, let me kind of give you a little bit of situated like where we are right now. So this quarter so far, we kind of did some review of 143 things. Then we talked about, for basically almost 2 weeks, these algorithmic analysis tools. Big O notation, big theta, big omega from the asymptotic analysis side. And then from kind of our code modeling, talked about case analysis and recurrences. But now with these tools, we have a toolbox that's full of different things we can use when trying to tackle understanding if a data structure is good in a particular situation or why we'd want this data structure in the first place. So now we're going to apply that theory that we've been practicing for the past 2 weeks in practice in different data structures and seeing how we can compare them. And so our first deep dive is going to be talking about this thing called hashing and hash maps. So our learning objectives for today's class is to have you be able to compare the relative pros and cons of various map implementations, especially given a design like the ones we've covered today. So I told you, this is how you might implement a hash map, being able to tell me what might be great about that implementation and what might not be so great. Being able to trace operations in this separate chaining hash map on paper. So if I describe this thing to you later in this lecture, you'd be able to simulate what it does on paper and also then be able to implement it, which you'll be doing on Project 2. So again, it's okay if you don't fully implement it today, you're going to be practicing that in Project 2. And then we're going to also be able to differentiate between the worst and in practice runtimes of a separate chaining hash map. And again, we'll talk about what that means. So those are our learning objectives. And what today's going to look like is we're going to talk about the map ADT in this review video. And then I'm going to talk about 4 different implementations of this map ADT, starting from the simplest array map, going all the way up to something more complex called the separate chaining hash map. Now, array map, the ends of the spectrum, array map and separate chaining hash map are the things you're going to be implementing on your project. So this lecture is going to be really helpful for Project 2. And the stuff in between is going to be kind of increasing the complexity a little bit to get to that last point, the separate chaining hash map. So in this video, we're going to talk about the map ADT and the array map implementation. The next video, we're going to talk about steps 2 and 3, these direct access maps and simple hash maps. And then in the last video, we're going to talk about this separate chaining hash map. So all this will make sense after all of these videos today. So as a bit of a review, let's talk about the map ADT. and the array map. So we introduced the map ADT at the beginning of the quarter. Remember, an ADT is a description of what something does, not how it does it. It describes a set of operations and how those operations should behave. So a map is a set of key value pairs, right? Each key is unique, and each key gets associated to a value. These are also sometimes called dictionaries. And we talked about in the map ADT how all of these operations are defined in terms of the keys. So if you put a key within a value, you associate that key to that value. If you put a key that's already there, it overwrites the value that's present there, and all these other operations. And we're going to use maps all the time in most algorithms, and not most, but many algorithms that we work with. Maps are a really good structure. In 143, we introduced two implementations of that, hash map and tree map. Today is all about understanding how hash map works under the hood. Next week, we're going to talk about how tree map works under the hood. And so we talked about some simple implementations of this map ADT in our theme of using array and linked structures. So we talked about the array map implementation, where you use an array of key value pairs. That array can resize, and you start at the beginning, storing key value pairs in the order that you insert them. So you can have, say your dictionary right now has 4 keys in it. A is associated to 1, B to 2, C to 3, D to 4. If you put B97, you start at the front and you scan through until you find the key you're looking for. If you find that key, you can just overwrite the value. And say if you're putting a new key in, you just stick it on at the end. And so we talked about pretty briefly when we first introduced this, we talked about ways of analyzing this code, talking about constant time versus linear time in these two cases, if the key's at the end, or if the key's the first one you looked at. And we actually were hinting at you of this idea of case analysis early on. But now we've given you the language to talk about if the key is the one looked at the end, or it's not in the dictionary, that's the worst case runtime. And if it's at the beginning, that's the best case runtime. And we could use big O, big theta, big omega analysis on that. We also talked about implementing it with a link structure. So instead of representing with an array, you use a bunch of linked nodes where each linked node has a key value pair. And it works very similarly. If you're searching for values, you just start at the front, scan till you find the key. Same thing with get, and put is the same deal. You just can change the values there. And we saw here for the runtimes, in the worst case, when the key you're looking for is at the end, or it's just not in the dictionary at all, you're in this O of n worst case runtime. And if you're in the best case, when the value's at the front, it's all constant time because we just have access to the value at the beginning. Now, what we're going to see here, and kind of the motivation for what we're going to be doing for the rest of the lecture, how to speed this up, is for all of these operations, in the worst case, when it's at the end, the reason this is slow is because we have to do a scan of all of the data to find the key we're looking for, right? In order to find the value associated key, we have to search through all key value pairs in the worst case. And so for the intuition for how we're going to speed this up is we're going to try to arrange the data in a way so that we know exactly where the key is whenever we're looking for something. But that's a bit of a spoiler for what we're going to be doing in the remaining videos.